My presentation is called Teaching Literature as Teaching Thought, and in it I'm going to discuss some of the recent debates to do with the place of literature in the university and some ways out of current deadlocks. I'll begin by discussing some recent criticism. I'll then discuss a teaching text with which I had recent success. It's William Maxwell's The Chateau. And then I'll discuss some of the ways in which the book in question helped my students feel and see and think their ways out of a particular impasse. To begin, I'm going to say that I think all of us, teachers and scholars of literature who teach at the university level, have become used to hearing horrifying prognoses about the future of literature at the university and within the university. Demands for justification, funding cuts, deadlocked departments, and so on have been met sometimes with hysterical defenses consequent upon the same. Critics such as Martha Nussbaum and Elaine Scarry recently have talked about the ways in which literature can be used to teach morality and ethics in different ways. Nussbaum, as some of you know, is very interested in the ties between literature and moral philosophy. She thinks of the ways in which literature can provide a roadmap, helping people to consider moral choices and ethical dilemmas. Scarry, on the other hand, again, as some of you know, is interested in the ways in which the corporeality of the body's materiality, and other forms of characterization can help us as readers imagine our way into a fuller understanding of the existence of other people, thereby, one hopes, providing a better ethical map through life. More recently still, younger critics such as Brian Hill and Marianne Massé have talked about the ways in which the experience of reading itself helps us to re-become human and to re-become individual. In a different way, Jacques Rancière does this as well. Hill and Massé and Rancière, in a different way, are interested in some very long-standing debates dating to Aristotle, again, as some of you know, to do with whether or not literature is mimetic only, reflective of reality, whether or not it's mimetic and creative at one and the same time, and more importantly, in some ways, what it can do and what it can help readers do and understand in life. Rancière and Massé in particular are interested in the ways in which reading as an experience helps to give form to life and to thought. And with Sartre, they're interested in the ways in which the experience of reading, the politics of reading, can help us as readers and thinkers to think about giving aesthetic and substantial weight and form to our experiences and thoughts. The one element I find lacking from these discussions is a consideration of what happens when students who have an overinflated sense of self and often poor reading skills confront a novel. What happens for the most part then, I've found, when dealing with certain groups of students, is a very limited sort of response and a need to destroy literature per se, the novel qua novel. For example, many of my students recently at a large public urban university in the US asked questions repeatedly such as, is he really saying that? Are they really saying that? When they didn't do that, their questions were along the lines of, but what is he actually saying? It was as if the meaning of the novel could be entirely summarized or were contained in a paraphrase, in a kernel of plot summary, thereby quashing the novel itself instantly. Upon the asking of these questions, all considerations of form, of language, point of view, structure, and so on would vanish. It was as if, in the students asking, the novel as itself was made to disappear in favor of something called plot, or the actual, or the true, or the hidden meaning. I'm going to talk now about what happens when those students encounter a particularly complex kind of novel, and the difference I think it made. I don't know what made the difference, but given the novel itself, I'm going to argue here for renewed attention to form and for renewed attention to students' perhaps innate, perhaps learned ability to grapple with form in a much deeper way than they have apparently been doing. First, I'll turn to the novel. The book, again, is William Maxwell's The Chateau, and in it, plot-wise, nothing happens with which readers of, for example, Henry James will not be familiar. An American couple called Harold and Barbara Rhodes travels to France soon after the end of the Second World War. They stay for part of the time in a chateau in Normandy. They travel to Italy and to other countries. They interact with their French hosts and friends relatives of the French family as well and others, and they encounter, unsurprisingly, a range of reserves, personalities, and so on. Problems sometimes ensue, and sometimes they do not. The book is very much a novel of manners, but I want to suggest here that what makes the novel itself so scintillating is the fact that Maxwell is super diligent and is even more attuned than are many, working in the same vein, to the need to focus on the singular and discrete detail. I'm going to talk here about characterization first and consciousness, then about descriptions and world building, next about point of view and knowledge, and finally about genre and ethics. And then I'll return to some questions relating to my students' understanding of the novel itself. It's part of Maxwell's gift to give to all his characters, major and minor, the utmost humanity he can bestow. There's no character in the novel who goes without a full self, feelings, thoughts, experiences, and so on. But more importantly, and more to the point here, is the fact that when he's dealing with his major characters, Maxwell is sure to give them as full and as lifelike a character as possible via a look at their experiences, senses, thoughts, and so on. For the novelist and for his characters, that's to say, sensing, thinking, feeling, remembering are life itself, and are as important at the individual level as are, say, the processes of travel, meeting people, and the moving through the plot per se. Vision, literal vision, is of crucial importance here. Harold, in particular, remembers things or likens things via analogy with French painters and paintings. Gauguin, Vuillard, Renoir, and others are some of his touchstones. His wife, Barbara, is less precise in her way of remembering and seeing. She thinks, for example, of a white chateau, a green lawn, but nevertheless color, space, and so on continue to matter a very great deal. At the same time, each character is surrounded by and immersed in a world of ever-changing and ever-moving pictures and narratives, which I'll speak about in a moment when I talk about description. The consciousness here, the building of consciousness, the development of a single consciousness is as important as any exterior action. And it's testament to Maxwell's skill that it's nearly impossible to read this book without being reminded of any individual's capacities and of the boundlessness of any individual life. When it comes to description, Maxwell creates a world, a physical world, on the page as beckoning, as replete, and as mysterious as life. It's as if he wants to say that the physical world and his character's experience of it matters as much as does the action itself, and is in fact part of the action itself. Paintings, as I've said, matter a great deal here. Reflections do as well. Mirrors, lakes, faces seen in windows, and so on. So do ghosts in the form of ghost stories, and the novel, again, is at very great pains to constantly immerse its characters in a world in which layer upon layer upon layer of picture and narrative of all the senses of a physical world as palpitant and as important as the interior world of any character carries a great deal of the weight of the novel. Clothing matters, landscapes matter, a certain gait matters, and they matter not only because of the way in which they tell us something of the characters' lives, but because of the ways in which the novel is committed to showing us the very individual and very individualized ways in which the characters think, feel, remember, and sense, thereby living and thereby giving form to their travels, to their days, and one sees by the end of the novel, to they themselves. It's most startling to note that the best example of the novel's imbrication of form and content comes at the very end, when, after a first section of several hundred pages, Leo and Virgo, we read a second section called Some Questions, in which the third-person omniscience of the first section is broken by a question-and-answer format. In that second section, a first-person narrator takes questions from an imaginary reader, an interlocutor, and asks the interlocutor what he would like to know. for the first time, given Maxwell's tact and discretion as a writer, there's a somewhat risque air hanging over the proceedings, in that the narrator taunts the imaginary reader somewhat with what has been withheld. Again, though, as always in this novel, the details themselves in some ways matter less than the fact of there having been mysteries withheld. It's in what Harold and Barbara have failed to understand, in what they've not comprehended or imagined, for example, about their hosts, that the novel's heart, in a certain way, lies. The imaginary reader asks questions such as, what happens to the American couple after they return home? How did the French family lose its money? Where was the husband of the French landlady? And so on. And to all, the narrator gives questions destined to enchant some readers and to infuriate others. Some readers will be reminded of the Thackeray of Vanity Fair. In any case, when they reached the final section, my students became engaged again in the process of reading the novel as the novel. I'm going to backtrack here for a minute and note that in many ways the process of reading the novel, The Chateau, is very much like the processes Harold and Barbara go through when they're traveling, meeting people, encountering others. They experience a great deal of anxiety some of the time. They are prey to misunderstandings and miscommunication. They wish very much not to be the stereotypical ugly Americans, and yet they tend to do things like break objects, stain things, flood rooms, all of that accidentally, of course, but in a way demanding its own sort of constant attention. Meanwhile, around them, people are starving, and it's testament to Maxwell's skill as a novelist that his commitment to plurality lies not only in giving us different points of view, different characters' thoughts, and so on, as many novelists do, but in making sure that there are different idioms, different ways of different languages for the detailing of different characters' memories, grasps of certain situations, and so on. At the novel's very end, for example, Madame Vienno, the French landlady, is seen alone in her house. She is free for those several pages of the assessment of any other characters, and for once in the novel, the tables are turned in the sense that she has ceded her own complement of reality without any intervention. Such is the novel's commitment, and the novelist's commitment, to a very important and I think often overlooked kind of plurality. In any case, the process of reading this novel can very easily be likened to the processes through which the main characters acquire knowledge and greater understanding. We are moving through a world in which visual and oral and so on details matter a very great deal. We are moving through a world in which it is easy to misunderstand, surrounded as we are by a welter of new people, new places, new impressions, and so on, and we are let know repeatedly by the novel's form and by its content that there is no other content. There is no other world, there is no hidden meaning. At the same time, we're reminded constantly that every human being in the novel might be and is containing worlds about which we ourselves know nothing. Likewise, Harold and Barbara. At first, my students suspected a trick, and the catchphrase reality versus appearance was popular for a few days. They suspected, that is, that the elaborate descriptions of landscapes, of interiors, of art were deliberately obscuring, or obfuscating, were meant to hide something. After that, as an immigrant, I can relate became a popular catchphrase for my students, as if the novel were a tiresome bureaucracy or a noxious government agency of some sort. Finally, though, when they reached the second section and the question and answer format contained therein, they became able to consider the novel as novel again. Paradoxically, that is, when the book called attention to its status as a work of art, to its status as a novel, when it broke with realist demands for verisimilitude, my students became able to grapple with questions of form, with questions of aesthetics, without needing a way in through identification, without needing a way in or out through hostile exclusion of an object. They became, that is, capable of thinking and capable of reading, and as each process, that is to say thinking and reading, became stronger, the novel qua novel, of course, sprang back to life